A man named Gerald came to see me at 76 after his daughter drove 4 hours to check on him because he had stopped returning her calls. When she arrived at his house, she found him sitting in the same chair she imagined he sat in every day, in a house that had not been properly cleaned in months, with a refrigerator containing 3 items, a loaf of bread that had gone stale, a jar of peanut butter, and a 2-liter bottle of soda. Gerald looked at her and said he was fine. He had been saying that to everyone for 2 years. By the time I examined him, he had lost 22 pounds of muscle since his last visit. His blood pressure had climbed to a level that required immediate intervention, and he was showing early signs of cognitive change that he had not mentioned to anyone because, as he told me, he did not want to be a burden. Gerald was not fine. Gerald had been disappearing quietly inside his own house, while everyone in his life assumed he was fine because he had always said he was fine. Gerald is not unusual. He is, in my 28 years, studying aging patterns across more than 9,000 patients between 65 and 95, one of the most common people I have ever met. He exists in a pattern so consistent that it has its own clinical language, its own research literature, and its own set of outcomes that most families are not aware of until the outcome has already arrived. Today, I am going to give you 5 facts about older men living alone that are surprising, that are supported by research, and that most families, most physicians, and most older men themselves do not fully understand. If you are an older man living alone, this is for you directly. If someone you love is an older man living alone, this is for you just as much. Subscribe before we continue. What comes next is the kind of information that changes outcomes when it arrives before the crisis rather than after. My name is Dr. David Mercer. I have spent 28 years studying aging patterns in over 9,000 patients. The pattern I am about to describe is one I have watched unfold hundreds of times. Each time the information arrived too late. This time, it does not have to. Fact number 1. Older men who live alone after losing a spouse die at dramatically higher rates than women in the same situation, and the window of highest risk is the first 2 years. This is called the widower effect, and the research on it is both consistent and striking. Men who lose a spouse experience mortality, increases of approximately 70% in the year following the loss. Women who lose a spouse experience mortality, increases of approximately 30% in the same period. Both numbers are significant. The gap between them is what surprises most people when they hear it for the first time. Men are more than twice as likely to die following spousal loss than women are, and the reasons are not primarily cardiac grief. They are practical and social, and they are correctable once they are understood. Here is what the research consistently shows. Women, as a group, maintain more diverse social networks than men across adulthood. Women tend to maintain friendships with other women, with family members, with community connections that are not dependent on the marital relationship. When a woman loses her spouse, she has an existing infrastructure of connection that absorbs some of the loss. When a man loses his spouse, he often loses his primary social connection, his primary emotional support, his primary person who monitored his health, managed his nutrition, noticed changes in him before he noticed them himself, and insisted he go to the doctor when he was inclined to wait and see. He does not just lose a partner. He loses the system that has been quietly sustaining him for decades. I worked with a man named Harold, 78, who came to see me approximately 8 months after losing his wife of 51 years. On paper, he was managing. He had family nearby. He had a neighbor who checked on him occasionally. He was eating, he was sleeping. But when I looked closely, what I saw was a man whose weight had dropped substantially, whose medication adherence had become inconsistent without his wife to organize the weekly pill boxes, whose primary social interaction most days was the television, and who described every day as fine even as his inflammatory markers told a different story. He had not had a meal with another person in 3 months. He genuinely did not see this as a problem. He said his wife had always done the socializing and he was not that kind of person. He did not understand that the socializing had been quietly sustaining his health in ways that had nothing to do with his preference for it. What families need to understand about this fact is that the risk is highest when the man himself appears to be managing. The quiet stoicism that presents as stability is often something else. The 2-year window matters. Proactive and specific check-ins during this period, not general calls to say hello, but specific involvement that creates actual shared time and activity significantly changes the trajectory for men in this situation. Before I walk you through the remaining 4 facts, I want to say this clearly. If you want to go beyond these 5 facts and learn about the 17 health concerns that matter most after 60 Ds, from strength and mobility to heart health, brain health, nutrition, and sleep, I have put everything into one straightforward ebook with practical steps you can actually use. The link is in the description below. Now let us get into it. Fact number 2. Older men living alone are nutritionally compromised in ways that are rarely visible from the outside. This is not a statement about poverty. Many of the men I see who are nutritionally deficient in meaningful ways are financially comfortable. They have food. The problem is not access. The problem is the combination of how men tend to cook after a lifetime of not cooking, how the appetite signals change after 70, and what happens to muscle mass, immune function, and cognitive clarity when protein and micronutrient intake drops below what the body needs. A significant percentage of older men who are widowed or otherwise living alone eat what could best be described as convenience nutrition. Toast, canned soup, sandwiches with deli meat, cereal. These foods are not harmful in the way that most people think of harm. They are harmful in what they fail to provide. An older man's body, after 70, requires approximately 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily to maintain muscle mass, higher than the requirement at 40 because of the anabolic resistance that develops with age. A bowl of cereal for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, and a can of soup for dinner may deliver adequate calories. It is delivering far less than half the protein required to prevent sarcopenia. The muscle loss that follows is slow enough to be invisible month to month. Over 2 or 3 years, it becomes unmistakable. Beyond protein, the micronutrient picture in men living alone tends to be poor. Vitamin D deficiency is extraordinarily common. B12 deficiency is common, particularly in men over 70 whose gastric acid production has declined, making B12 harder to absorb from food. Zinc deficiency affects immune function and wound healing. These deficiencies develop slowly, without dramatic symptoms, and their effects, reduced immune response, slower cognitive processing, increased fall risk from muscle weakness, often get attributed to normal aging rather than to addressable nutritional gaps. A man named Frank came in at 74 in what appeared to be reasonable health. He told me he was eating 3 meals a day. When I asked him to describe those meals specifically, the pattern became clear. He had been surviving on a diet that was heavy in simple carbohydrates, light in protein, and nearly absent in vegetables for more than a year. His B12 was depleted. His vitamin D was critically low. His grip strength had declined measurably from his previous visit. He had put on weight while simultaneously losing muscle, a pattern called sarcopenic obesity, which is common in men whose caloric intake is adequate but whose macronutrient composition is wrong. Frank had not chosen this diet. He had defaulted into it because his wife had managed the household nutrition for 45 years, and no one had prepared him for what it meant to do that himself. The practical response to this fact is not complicated, but it requires someone other than the man himself to initiate it. Meal delivery services designed for older adults, regular meals with family members that include protein-dense foods, a nutritional assessment at annual medical visits that specifically asks what a person is eating rather than whether they are eating. These interventions cost relatively little, and their impact on long-term health is significant. Fact number 3. Older men living alone systematically underreport symptoms to their doctors, and the gap between what they are experiencing and what they report is often measured in years. This is the fact that I find most important to convey and also the most difficult to address, because it is rooted in something that is genuinely characteristic of how many men, particularly men who grew up in the mid-20th century, relate to their own bodies and to the act of asking for help. The cultural framework is familiar. Men do not complain. Men push through. A man who mentions symptoms is a man who is weak or worried, or making too much of something. This framework was a social adaptation in many contexts. In the context of health management after 70, it is a mechanism of serious harm. What I see in clinical practice is a consistent pattern. A man reports no new symptoms. An examination or incidental finding reveals a condition that is not new. Follow-up questioning Asking specifically and persistently about symptoms with the explicit statement that the information matters medically reveals that the symptom has been present for months, sometimes years, and was not mentioned because it did not seem important enough, because he did not want to take up the appointment time, because he assumed it was just age, because he did not want his family to worry, or because acknowledging it felt like admitting something he did not want to admit. The symptom that has been present for 2 years is not the same clinical situation as the symptom that appeared last week. The window for intervention is different. The options available are different. The outcomes are different. A patient named Thomas came in for a routine visit at 71. He listed no complaints on his intake form. He said everything was fine when I asked the opening question. During the examination, I noticed changes in his presentation that prompted me to ask specifically about fatigue. He said he was a little tired, but it was nothing. I asked how long. He said a while. I pressed him to be specific about what a while meant. He eventually said probably since last winter, which was 14 months earlier. 14 months of fatigue that had not been mentioned. Further questioning, done carefully and without judgment, revealed urinary symptoms he had attributed to normal aging and not considered worth mentioning. Sleep disruption he had assumed was just how things were now. And a change in his thinking clarity, a sense that words came more slowly, and names took longer to find. That he had not mentioned to anyone because he was afraid of what it might mean and had decided that not knowing was preferable to knowing. The combination of symptoms pointed toward a specific and treatable condition. By the time we were having that conversation, 14 months had passed since the symptoms began. The condition was significantly more advanced than it needed to be. The treatment options available to us were narrower than they would have been 14 months earlier. Thomas did not withhold this information because he was being deceptive. He withheld it in the way that many older men withhold health information, by not categorizing it as information worth sharing, by applying a threshold of what constitutes a real problem that was calibrated to a younger and more resilient body, and by defaulting to the belief that mentioning something was making too much of it. For families with older men living alone, the practical implication of this fact is to stop asking "How are you?" and start asking specific questions. What changed in the last 6 months? Is there anything that hurts? Is there anything that feels different from a year ago? Is there anything you have been meaning to mention to the doctor but have not? The general question gives the man permission to say, "Fine." The specific question makes it harder to simply deflect. Accompany him to medical appointments when possible. The information shared in a room with a family member present is consistently different from the information shared in a room alone. Fact number 4. Social isolation in older men produces physiological changes that are measurable in blood work, and loneliness in this population significantly increases the risk of both dementia and premature death in ways that parallel major physical risk factors. When most people hear about the health consequences of loneliness, they imagine a psychological mechanism. They picture a lonely person feeling sad, and sadness leading to poor health behaviors, less exercise, worse eating, less sleep. That pathway is real. But the physiological mechanism runs in parallel and is distinct. It does not require the person to feel sad. It does not require the person to identify as lonely, which most isolated older men do not. It operates at the level of inflammatory signaling in the blood, independently of mood, independently of self-report. Research from several large longitudinal studies has documented elevated inflammatory markers in chronically isolated older adults. Interleukin-6, C-reactive protein, and other indicators of systemic inflammation run measurably higher in people who have few regular social interactions, controlling for other lifestyle variables. These inflammatory markers are the same markers associated with cardiovascular disease, with accelerated cognitive decline, with disrupted sleep architecture, with impaired immune response. The loneliness is not just a feeling, it is a metabolic state. And for older men who are socially isolated but who do not describe themselves as lonely, who describe themselves as fine with being alone, who say they have never been very social, the biological response is occurring regardless of their subjective experience. A study from the University of Chicago followed adults over 65 for several years and found that those who experienced high levels of social isolation had approximately a 64% higher rate of cognitive decline than those who maintained regular social connection, adjusting for other factors. A separate analysis from Brigham Young University found that loneliness carried mortality risk comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes daily. These are not soft findings. They are consistent across large samples in multiple countries, and they have a particular relevance for older men living alone because older men living alone are among the most socially isolated groups in any modern society, and the majority of them are describing themselves as fine. Gerald, the man I described at the opening of this video, eventually told me something important after we had been working together for several months. He said he had not realized how quiet his life had become until it started to become less quiet. He had not identified what he was experiencing as loneliness because he did not feel what he thought loneliness was supposed to feel like. He felt numb. He felt like time passed without much texture. He felt like the days were similar to each other in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. That description, the flatness of it, the absence of distress, is actually characteristic of how isolation presents in many older men. The alarm is not ringing loudly, it has gone quiet. The intervention for this fact requires intentional structure rather than general goodwill. Calling to check in helps. Structured regular visits that appear on a calendar, that repeat on a schedule, that involve shared activity rather than just conversation, help more. If there is a faith community, a local senior center, a hobby group, a volunteer opportunity, the structure those organizations provide creates social contact that does not depend on the man's motivation or inclination on any given day. That structure is what most isolated older men need and will not initiate themselves. Fact number 5. The home environment of an older man living alone becomes physically dangerous faster than most families realize, and the most dangerous element is usually not what anyone is watching. Most people who think about home safety for older adults think about bathroom grab bars, stair rails, and scatter rugs. These are real hazards and they deserve attention. But in my clinical experience working with older men living alone, the most significant home safety concerns are less visible and less discussed, and they are connected directly to the other facts in this list. The first element is medication management. When a man is living alone without the organizational support that most couples share without ever formally discussing it, medication errors become common. Missed doses, doubled doses, medications taken at the wrong time, medications that interact with each other in ways that affect blood pressure or blood sugar or cognitive clarity. Medication errors in older adults are responsible for a substantial percentage of emergency hospitalizations. Many of those hospitalizations could have been prevented by a system for managing medications rather than reliance on memory, which becomes less reliable after 70, even in people with no formal cognitive change. The second element is the physical state of the home itself. Men living alone after years of a shared household are often uncertain about or uninterested in home maintenance. The things that kept the home functional, regular cleaning that removes fall hazards, maintenance that addresses small issues before they become large ones, attention to lighting levels that may have become inadequate as both the house and the occupant have changed over time, these tend to decline. A home that was well organized when two people maintained it can become progressively hazardous as one person, managing more than he realized his partner had been managing, allows things to slide. The third element, and the one I want to emphasize most specifically, is the delay between when a problem occurs and when another person knows about it. A fall that happens in a home where another person is present is a fall that gets a response immediately. A fall that happens in a home where a man lives alone is a fall that may not be discovered for hours or days. A change in orientation or sudden confusion that happens to a man with someone present is a change that prompts a call to the doctor that day. The same change happening to a man alone may simply become part of the day, unexplained, unreported, and potentially serious. A patient named Walter, 77, fell in his garage reaching for something on a high shelf. He was not seriously injured, but he could not get up independently for approximately 2 hours. He lay on the concrete floor of his garage waiting for his body to cooperate, in a house where no one would come looking for him until his daughter called the following evening. He told me about this 6 weeks later, casually, as context for something else he was describing. He had not mentioned it to his children. He had not mentioned it at his last appointment. He had waited until it resolved, assessed that nothing permanent had happened, and continued with his life. He did not identify it as an event worth reporting because nothing catastrophic had occurred. What Walter could not see was the complete picture. A man alone on a concrete floor for 2 hours is not simply an inconvenience, it is a preview. The same fall that resolved this time will eventually not resolve. The same gap between when the fall happened and when anyone would have known about it is a gap that, in a different version of the same event, has a different ending. When I asked Walter directly whether he thought about what would have happened if the fall had been more serious, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he tried not to think about that. That sentence, "I try not to think about that," is one of the most common things I hear from older men living alone when we touch on their actual vulnerability. Not denial exactly, more like a deliberate management of awareness. They know the risk exists. They have decided not to examine it directly because examining it feels like giving it power or admitting something they are not ready to admit. The practical response to this fact begins with a home assessment, ideally by a physical or occupational therapist who specializes in aging in place, or at minimum by a family member who walks through the home with specific attention to lighting, floor surfaces, bathroom safety, step heights, and the accessibility of items the man reaches for regularly. Medication management requires a system rather than willpower or memory. A weekly pill organizer checked by a family member or a pharmacy blister pack service removes the reliance on memory for something too important to depend on memory for. And a check-in protocol, a specific daily or every other day contact that is brief but consistent, creates a safety net that means the gap between a problem occurring and someone knowing about it is measured in hours rather than days or longer. 5 facts. Men living alone after spousal loss face a mortality risk window that is higher than most families appreciate, and the risk is highest when the man appears to be managing. Nutritional compromise in older men living alone runs deep and is not visible from the outside, with protein and micronutrient deficiency quietly accelerating muscle loss and cognitive change over years. Symptom underreporting in older men routinely delays treatment by months or years, and addressing it requires specific questions and active presence rather than general check-ins. Social isolation in older men produces measurable inflammatory consequences that parallel known physical risk factors, regardless of whether the man identifies himself as lonely. And the home environment deteriorates in safety faster than families expect, with medication errors and fall response gaps as the most consequential hazards. None of these facts point toward a single intervention. None of them have a supplement or a prescription as the primary answer. They point toward connection, toward structure, toward the presence of people who know what to watch for and who show up on a regular schedule without waiting for a reason to show up. Gerald is doing considerably better 2 years after that initial visit. His daughter moved the check-ins from general calls to weekly visits with a meal. His medication management moved from memory to a pharmacy blister pack service. He joined a monthly breakfast group at his local senior center with other men his age, a structure that provides what I told his daughter was the most important prescription I could write for him. Somewhere to be on a regular schedule with people who would notice if he was not there. That is what this is really about. Not decline as an inevitability. Not isolation as something that simply happens. People who are paying close attention, with the right information, making the daily choices that change what comes next.